A millionaire thought his wife had vanished for good after discovering his affair, just another closed chapter in his flawless empire. But years later, she returns without warning, carrying a secret so powerful it dismantles everything he built. What she reveals doesn't just ruin his reputation. It exposes the darkest truth he thought he buried forever. The chandelier sparkled like a constellation suspended in the vast ceiling of the penthouse, casting golden light over polished marble floors and velvet-draped walls. Every inch of the space screamed opulence, curated with an obsessive precision that only a man like Donovan Blake could afford or demand. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of scotch in hand, surveying the city below with the casual detachment of a ruler overlooking his dominion. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, just the way he liked it. Donovan wasn't just a millionaire. He was an empire unto himself. Media mogul, investor, real estate tycoon. His name opened doors, silenced opposition, and sparked envy in boardrooms across the country. He wore tailored suits like armor, smiled like a predator, and carried himself with the ease of someone who believed the world owed him its loyalty. But beyond the accolades and flashing cameras, there was a hunger in Donovan that no deal or headline could satisfy. A hunger for dominance, for admiration, for being untouchable. To the world, Donovan and his wife, Elise, were a picture-perfect couple. She was poised, graceful, and elegant, the kind of woman who made headlines without ever raising her voice. At charity galas and art exhibitions, she stood beside him like an ornament, admired, photographed, but rarely heard. Yet behind the silent glances and polished smiles was a marriage forged not in love, but strategy. Elise had married Donovan at a time when he was still rising, and she, the daughter of a reputable judge, had brought him social legitimacy. For Donovan, she was an asset, a necessary one. But like every asset, he believed he could control her, shelve her, or replace her when the time came. Donovan's indiscretions were no secret among the elite. Whispers floated through cocktail parties, exchanged with smirks behind champagne flutes. Models, interns, assistants, women came and went like passing seasons in his life. Elise, however, never confronted him. She remained steady, quiet, and composed. But her silence wasn't ignorance, it was calculation. And Donovan, arrogant as ever, mistook her stillness for submission. That night, as Donovan poured himself another drink and stared at the city's glow, Elise stood in the dimly lit hallway, just out of sight. She watched him in silence, absorbing his smugness, his obliviousness, and something in her gaze shifted, something deep, heavy, and unspoken. He hadn't noticed her watching. He never did. That was the nature of their relationship. He overlooked, and she endured. But Elise was not a woman to be underestimated, not a woman to be shelved without consequence. Their bedroom, spacious and cold, mirrored the distance between them. He spoke to her only when necessary, small talk, event details, surface-level interactions. He rarely asked how she felt or what she needed, and she never offered more than he demanded. But there was a storm brewing inside Elise, something he couldn't see, something he would never anticipate. It was on a rainy Thursday that Elise disappeared. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic argument, no trace of her. Her phone was left behind, her clothes untouched. One moment, she was there, calm, passive, ever gracious, and the next, she was gone. Donovan returned from a business meeting to find her side of the closet undisturbed and her vanity table still arranged just the way she always left it. But her presence had vanished, like a whisper stolen by the wind. At first, Donovan didn't panic. He assumed she had gone to visit her sister or taken a spontaneous trip. Elise was reserved, yes, but not impulsive. Days passed, then a week. Still no word. The silence stretched, heavy and cold. He filed a missing person report out of obligation, more concerned with how it would look to the press than with her safety. He made appearances on morning news shows, feigning concern and sorrow, his voice perfectly modulated for sympathy. "Elise is the love of my life," he said to the cameras, "and I just want her home." But behind the scenes, he felt only relief, a twisted sense of freedom. He believed she had abandoned the marriage, and in his mind, that only confirmed what he already felt. She had become unnecessary. Within weeks, Donovan resumed his routines. He hosted investors, partied with socialites, and dined with new, younger companions. He barely mentioned Elise again. To him, her absence was an unfortunate hiccup in an otherwise flawless life. He restructured the company's PR narrative, painting himself as a grieving husband still committed to his empire. Sympathy flowed, stocks rose, and Donovan, ever the strategist, felt invincible once again. But a subtle unease lingered in the corners of his mind. Quiet moments when he found himself staring at her empty seat at dinner or glancing at the untouched books she used to read. It wasn't guilt. Donovan didn't believe in guilt. It was annoyance, a flicker of something he couldn't name, an irritant beneath the surface. He convinced himself that Elise would eventually be declared legally dead, and life would carry on, clean, simple, under his control. Months passed. The city moved on. The tabloids shifted focus. But somewhere deep in Donovan's gut, an echo of her silence remained. He couldn't shake the thought that Elise hadn't just vanished. She had vanished deliberately. Still, his pride refused to accept the possibility that he had been outmaneuvered. Then one morning, an envelope appeared at the front desk of his office building. There was no return address, just a crisp, white envelope with his name printed in elegant, familiar handwriting. Donovan opened it without hesitation, expecting perhaps a legal notice or a letter from a fan. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just 6 words, written in that same familiar hand. "You don't know what's coming, Donovan." His heart skipped, just for a second. He stared at the message, reading it over and over, trying to decipher its meaning. But he shook it off with a laugh. Just a prank, he told himself. Someone playing games. It meant nothing. But deep inside, something stirred. A seed of doubt. A whisper of fear. For the first time in a long while, Donovan Blake, the untouchable millionaire, master of manipulation, king of the empire, felt a chill crawl down his spine. And somewhere far away, Elise watched the city skyline from a distance, her expression unreadable, her plan already in motion. And if you were in Elise's shoes, would you have come back or disappeared forever? Let us know in the comments below. Rate the story from 0 to 10 so far, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see how this unfolds. The boardroom smelled of leather and power, the scent of old money clinging to every polished surface and silent gaze. Donovan Blake sat at the head of the massive glass table, fingers interlocked, watching his executives shuffle papers, murmuring over quarterly reports and revenue charts. From the outside, nothing had changed. His empire still stood tall, his voice still commanded attention, his name still opened doors. But beneath the surface, the silence around Elise's disappearance was beginning to stir the air in unsettling ways. It had been over 2 months since Elise vanished, and although Donovan had done everything in his power to control the narrative, cracks were forming. The initial sympathy from the public had slowly turned into speculative whispers. Journalists who had once praised his resilience were now digging deeper. Where had she gone? Why was there no trace? Why did Donovan seem so composed, so unaffected? Behind the gloss of staged interviews and solemn soundbites, questions simmered in hushed corners. Still, Donovan wore his mask well. At charity auctions, he toasted to Elise's memory with a perfect blend of grief and strength. At press conferences, he spoke of his undying hope that she would return safely. But behind closed doors, he had already moved on. His penthouse, once adorned with her favorite books and delicate touches, had been redesigned. Neutral tones replaced soft pastels. Sleek modern furniture substituted Elise's classic taste. It was as if she had never existed. Her photographs had vanished from frames. Her scent no longer lingered on silk pillows. To Donovan, erasing her was part of regaining control. In the privacy of his inner circle, he barely mentioned her name. His assistant, Marla, understood the unspoken rule: Elise was a closed chapter. Any inquiries from the media were met with vague responses and redirections. Still, Donovan couldn't completely ignore the unease in his investors' eyes. At a recent meeting, one of his oldest partners had hesitated before shaking his hand, his tone laced with discomfort. "You doing okay, Don?" he asked quietly, away from prying ears. "You know, with everything going on?" Donovan smiled, casual and rehearsed. "I'm managing. Elise would want me to keep going, keep building. That's what I'm doing." The partner nodded but didn't look convinced. Even as Donovan pushed forward, launching new ventures, acquiring smaller companies, expanding his reach, a strange anxiety began to hum beneath his composed exterior. He was used to winning, used to conquering obstacles by sheer force of will. But Elisa's silence, her vanishing act, it wasn't something he could outmaneuver or buy off. It hung over him like a phantom, unsettling his sleep, slipping into his thoughts during meetings. He told himself it was just guilt, a lingering remnant of their final months together. But the truth ran deeper. He had the nagging sense that something was unfinished. Then came the second envelope. This one arrived at his personal residence, slipped under the front door with no sound, no trace. He found it in the early morning, before the housekeeper arrived. A simple white envelope again, no return address. Inside was a folded piece of thick paper, the handwriting identical to the first. This time, it said, "You buried the truth, but it remembers you." Donovan stared at the message for a long time. His pulse quickened, but he didn't show it. He burned the letter in his fireplace, watched the flames eat away at the edges until nothing remained but black ash. He told no one about it, not even Marla, not the security team, not the private investigator he had discreetly hired weeks earlier, not to find Elise, but to monitor potential media leaks. He didn't want anyone knowing. He felt the first true tremor of fear. That day, Donovan called a special meeting with his legal team. He spoke in vague terms, pretending it was about securing assets and preparing for hostile takeovers. But underneath it all, he was trying to prepare for something he couldn't name. He didn't believe in ghosts, but this didn't feel like coincidence. Someone was watching him, someone who knew more than they should. To distract himself, he began seeing Victoria Hale, a striking woman half his age, a model-turned-entrepreneur whose company he had invested in just months earlier. Victoria was everything Elise wasn't: loud, glamorous, openly ambitious. She didn't ask questions about the past. She didn't sit in silence. She was a whirlwind of distraction, and Donovan welcomed it. He brought her to public events, dined with her at rooftop restaurants, and made sure paparazzi captured every angle. The tabloids devoured the new couple, speculating whether Donovan had finally moved on. He let them believe it. But behind the scenes, things were unraveling. It started small. A leaked memo from one of his acquisitions showing predatory business practices. A disgruntled former employee going on record in a podcast, speaking about internal corruption. These were manageable issues, or so Donovan thought. He threw money at them, issued denials, and tightened internal controls. But the problems kept coming. Anonymous emails to journalists, anonymous tips to regulators. He didn't know where the leaks were coming from, but each one struck deeper. His instincts told him it wasn't coincidence. At night, Donovan would lie awake in bed beside Victoria, staring at the ceiling, playing back the last few weeks of Elisa's presence. There was something she had said, something he couldn't forget. A sentence, casually spoken, months before she disappeared. Every empire thinks it's invincible, until it starts crumbling from within. He'd laughed at the time, dismissing it as one of her poetic musings. But now, it echoed in his mind, louder with each new setback. He began reviewing old security footage, conversations, contracts. He even called in a forensic auditor to review internal communications. He was chasing a ghost, and he didn't even know where to start. Then came the third envelope. This time, it wasn't left in his home or office. It was hand-delivered by a courier during a board meeting, sealed in a black envelope. Donovan opened it in front of everyone, expecting a financial document or legal notice. Instead, it held a photograph. It was Elise, standing on a beach somewhere, dressed in white linen, smiling. Not the controlled, camera-ready smile she used to wear in public, but a genuine, radiant one. She looked free. Behind her was a child playing in the sand, too far to identify clearly, but unmistakably there. Donovan's heart stopped. He excused himself from the meeting without explanation. In his private office, he stared at the photograph, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. What did it mean? Where had the photo been taken? Who was the child? Why was she sending it now? He poured himself a drink, his hands still shaking. The image burned itself into his mind. He didn't know what was real anymore. For the first time in his life, Donovan Blake felt powerless, not because someone had outplayed him in business, but because something beyond his reach was closing in, slowly, deliberately, with a precision he couldn't understand. And far from the chaos he was starting to feel, Elise watched from a distance, each step of her plan unfolding exactly as she had designed. The ballroom shimmered under the weight of crystal chandeliers, their light scattering across polished marble floors and mirrored columns. It was one of those high society galas where elegance was currency and appearances were everything. Waiters in white gloves glided silently between silk-draped tables, offering champagne on silver trays. Donovan Blake stood near the center, effortlessly surrounded by an orbit of sycophants, business elites, and whispered admiration. His tailored tuxedo clung to him like a second skin, his signature smile sharp, practiced, confident. He looked every bit the untouchable millionaire he had always presented to the world. Victoria Hale clung to his arm in a red satin dress that left little to the imagination, drawing eyes and envy in equal measure. The press hovered near the velvet ropes, clicking cameras and capturing curated moments of wealth and power. Donovan held court, laughing effortlessly, exchanging pleasantries, brushing off questions about his expanding empire. If anyone still remembered Elise, they didn't mention her tonight. She had become a ghost in public memory, a story the tabloids had buried beneath newer, flashier scandals. Just as Donovan had hoped. But that night, a shadow slipped quietly through the glittering crowd, elegant, poised, unannounced. She stepped into the ballroom with the grace of a whisper, unnoticed at first, her presence too calm to stir attention immediately. But slowly, like ripples from a pebble dropped in still water, heads began to turn. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Champagne glasses halted midair. One by one, eyes shifted, curiosity giving way to disbelief. She wore a midnight blue gown that clung delicately to her form, understated but exquisite, paired with a pearl necklace that gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Her hair, now a sleek dark auburn, was swept into a low chignon, and her expression was serene, untouched by fear or urgency, but lined with something deeper, something unshakable. Donovan didn't see her at first. He was mid-conversation with a tech investor when his attention was caught by the silence blooming around him. He turned his head casually, following the stunned stares of the room, and then he saw her. Elise. His breath caught, but he didn't let it show. His jaw remained tight, his shoulders straight. He blinked once, slow and deliberate, trying to make sense of the vision before him. She didn't look like someone who had vanished without a trace. She looked radiant, alive, controlled, empowered. Everything about her presence defied the image the media had painted, a fragile woman who had likely suffered a breakdown and fled from the pressure of life at the side of a powerful man. This woman wasn't lost. She wasn't afraid. She was a statement. Donovan excused himself, brushing Victoria's hand away without explanation, and made his way through the crowd. As he approached, Elise turned her gaze toward him, her eyes meeting his with unwavering calm. He stopped just a few feet from her, caught off guard by the steadiness in her expression. There was no fear, no hesitation, only quiet defiance. "Elise," he said, his voice low, tight with control, his mouth forming the name he had avoided for so long. "Donovan," she replied, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips, not warm, not bitter, just knowing. "You're alive," he said, as if the words would somehow make sense of the chaos unraveling inside him. "Clearly," she replied, her gaze never faltering. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, calculating his next move, glancing around at the sea of watching eyes and murmuring mouths. "Where have you been?" he asked, lowering his voice, leaning in slightly. "Everywhere you didn't look," she said simply, tilting her head as if studying a stranger, not a husband. "Why now?" he asked, barely concealing the tension beneath his voice. "Because now matters," she said cryptically, then looked past him at the press, still snapping photos in confusion. "Don't worry. I'm not here to cause a scene. That's not my style." Donovan clenched his jaw, the calm she exuded unsettling him more than any dramatic confrontation could. He wanted to drag her somewhere private, demand explanations, assert control. But her presence, composed, untouched by his dominance, rendered him powerless in a way he hadn't anticipated. She turned to walk away, leaving him standing in the middle of the ballroom, stunned. But just before she disappeared into the crowd again, she paused and looked back. "We'll talk soon, Donovan. There's still so much you don't understand." Those words followed him like a whisper through the rest of the evening. He couldn't focus. Every glance felt like scrutiny. Every polite conversation, a mask hiding questions people were too stunned to ask aloud. He slipped out early, leaving Victoria behind, returning to his penthouse in a state of disbelief. The moment he entered the silence of his home, he poured a drink, trying to shake the image of her calm gaze from his mind. He paced, restless, haunted by the controlled power in her voice. Elise hadn't returned like a lost wife seeking reconciliation. She had returned like a force. He knew that look in her eyes. It was the same look he saw in the mirror before a hostile takeover. And that terrified him. He ordered a background check. He wanted to know where she'd been, who she'd been with, what she'd been doing. But every lead came up clean, or worse, empty. There were no medical records, no travel logs, no financial trails. It was as if she had disappeared entirely from the system and re-emerged by design. 3 nights later, she sent him another letter. Hand-delivered again, placed neatly on the desk in his private study despite his security system. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an explanation. Just one line, "You think this is about you, but you're only a piece of it." Donovan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark, staring at the letter, trying to decipher the message. Elise wasn't just back. She had come back with intention, with precision, with something he couldn't yet define, but he knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. And somewhere deep in the pit of his stomach, something ancient stirred. Fear, real fear. The kind he hadn't felt since before he had money, power, or control. Because Donovan Blake had built an empire on secrets, betrayal, and manipulation. But what happens when the person you underestimated the most turns out to be the only one who truly understood the architecture of your downfall? He would soon find out. The morning air was thick with tension, though the sky outside Donovan Blake's penthouse was clear and indifferent. He stood in his study, fingers curled tightly around the letter Elise had sent him, eyes flicking across the words again and again. "You think this is about you, but you're only a piece of it." The sentence reverberated in his mind, a riddle too cryptic for a man used to tangible problems. Ones he could buy, bully, or bury. He hadn't slept since the gala. Her reappearance had done more than rattle him. It had cracked something deeper, something that control couldn't mend. He had no idea where this was heading, and that terrified him more than he'd admit. Donovan had his assistant cancel all appointments for the day. He claimed fatigue, but in truth, he needed space. Mental space, emotional space, a moment to breathe without the ever-looming pressure of pretending to be untouchable. He sat in his leather chair, phone in hand, scrolling through security reports and background checks. Still nothing. No addresses. No receipts. No trace of Elise's whereabouts over the past 2 years. Not even a traffic ticket. It was as if she'd erased herself from existence and resurfaced with purpose. But what disturbed him more was that her presence had triggered something else. Memories. Not of her disappearance, but of her last months in the house. Details he had dismissed now returned with clarity, like puzzle pieces that had always been there, but were only now taking shape. He remembered the way she used to sit quietly on the terrace, staring at the city as if seeing beyond its surface. The cryptic books she read, the questions she asked about his work, not with suspicion, but with curiosity that now felt calculated. She had never raised her voice, never accused, never cried. But maybe she hadn't needed to. Maybe she had been gathering pieces all along, and Donovan had been too arrogant to see it. He poured himself a drink and wandered through the apartment, suddenly feeling like a stranger in his own home. Elise's touch was gone, but her shadow had returned, lingering in every room, every echo of silence. In the guest room, her favorite space for reading, he found one of her old journals, wedged beneath a drawer. The cover was plain, unassuming. He hesitated, then opened it. It wasn't a diary, not in the traditional sense. There were no declarations of love or heartbreak. Instead, it was filled with observations, business strategies, notes about his meetings, names of people he'd mentioned in passing, details about acquisitions he had never publicly shared. She'd been listening, all that time, with an intent he'd never noticed. There were even notes questioning the legality of certain mergers, scribbled side by side with newspaper clippings and timelines. His breath caught. Elise hadn't just been his wife. She had been studying him, preparing. Across the city, Elise sat quietly in a sunlit cafe tucked between 2 galleries, an unassuming place she'd frequented since her return. She sipped tea slowly, flipping through a notebook of her own, not the same one Donovan had found, but another, more recent. Her expression was calm, but her mind was a storm. The gala had been only the first move. Now the game was truly beginning. She thought of how it all started, how she had begun to suspect that Donovan's betrayals weren't limited to their marriage. The affairs were just the surface. It was what lay beneath that frightened her. The manipulation, the disregard for consequences, the way he spoke of ruining competitors as if he were pruning weeds from a garden. She had spent months wondering if she had been foolish to stay. But Elise was not foolish. She was strategic. She remembered the moment she decided to leave, not in fear, but with purpose. It was during one of his meetings at home, when Donovan had spoken, unaware that she was listening from the hallway. He had laughed about a buyout that crushed an entire local manufacturer, one owned by a family-run business for decades. They never saw it coming, he'd said, sipping wine. That's the thing with people like them. Sentiment blinds them. Profit always wins. That sentence had stayed with her like a scar. In the weeks that followed, Elise began her plan. She didn't confront him. She didn't scream or beg. She quietly contacted lawyers, transferred a portion of her inheritance into an unreachable trust, packed essentials under the guise of donating clothes, and disappeared on a carefully chosen day, when Donovan would be away for a shareholder retreat. She left no trace because she didn't want to be followed. She didn't want revenge then. She wanted understanding, distance, perspective. But what she found in that distance was clarity. She traveled alone, first to small towns, then abroad. She stayed in modest places, changed her appearance subtly, and took time to think, to gather, research, prepare. She met with people Donovan had harmed, small business owners, former employees, even a whistleblower he had publicly discredited. Each story added a layer to her understanding. Each tear, each bankruptcy, each suicide attempt, threads woven through the empire Donovan so proudly flaunted. He hadn't built an empire. He had constructed a monument of pain and silence. So Elise came back. Not for drama, not for confrontation, but for consequence. She didn't want a messy scandal. She wanted a reckoning, a precise, surgical dismantling. The kind of unraveling Donovan would never see coming until it was too late. Back in the penthouse, Donovan had grown more agitated. He called his security chief, demanding tighter surveillance. He hired another private investigator. He even began questioning his own staff. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone within his circle was working against him. But the real truth was harder to swallow. His enemy was never outside. It had always been the woman he thought he had outgrown. The woman he underestimated. That night, another letter arrived. This time, it came with a small box. Donovan opened it cautiously, fingers tense. Inside the box was a flash drive and a single sentence on a card. Play it. You'll recognize the voices. His heart raced as he plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing an audio file titled The Foundation. He clicked play, and then he heard himself. His own voice, clear as day, speaking in a recording from 2 years ago. A private meeting. An acquisition discussion. He was laughing as he described firing an entire department preemptively to avoid legal risk. Talking about manipulating contract clauses. Naming individuals who would be financially ruined but were acceptable losses. His blood ran cold. The recording continued, damning in its detail, impossible to deny. Elise hadn't just planned a return, she had built a case. And this was only the beginning. He sat back, pale, stunned, as the audio played on. The empire he built on betrayal was shaking, and for the first time, Donovan Blake didn't know how to stop it. The audio file echoed in Donovan Blake's head long after it had stopped playing. Even with the speakers silent and the room dark, he could still hear his own voice, smug and cold, detailing the destruction of lives as though he were discussing numbers on a spreadsheet. That flash drive was more than a threat, it was evidence. And it wasn't in the hands of a journalist, a rival, or a disgruntled employee. It was in the hands of Elise, the woman he thought he had buried in the past, who now returned not as a ghost, but as a reckoning. Donovan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, staring at the city lights, the glow no longer comforting but accusatory. Elise was orchestrating something he couldn't fully see, and that was what disturbed him most. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, He controlled markets, narratives, people. But now, with each move she made, she was dismantling the illusion piece by piece. And the worst part was that she hadn't even spoken publicly. She hadn't given an interview, filed a lawsuit, or called a press conference. Her silence was deafening because it was deliberate, and Donovan knew silence that purposeful was dangerous. In the days that followed, his empire began to tremble in ways that no amount of PR could patch. It started with a leak to a small but persistent online news outlet. An investigative piece, anonymous sources, detailed documents, recorded conversations. The article didn't mention Elise, but Donovan recognized every word. The acquisition she had documented, the names, the quotes, it was all there. And even though the outlet was modest, it spread like wildfire, picked up by larger networks within hours. The stock took a minor hit. Investors started calling, not with panic yet, but with concern. The board demanded answers. Donovan gave them rehearsed statements about sabotage, fake news, disgruntled ex-employees. But his voice, once commanding, now sounded defensive. At home, paranoia began to creep into his routines. He checked for listening devices. He had the penthouse swept twice a week. He changed passwords, restricted access to files, fired 2 assistants he barely trusted. He began second-guessing everyone, his staff, his lawyers, even Victoria. Especially Victoria. She asked too many questions lately, and her curiosity about Elise's reappearance had started to sound like suspicion. He told himself it was just stress, that he was imagining things, but deep down he knew Elise's reach was growing. Then came the second article, this time in a mainstream business publication. It painted a picture not just of questionable business decisions, but of a pattern of unethical behavior stretching over years. Whistleblowers came forward. People who had once signed NDAs now choosing to speak, emboldened by anonymity or perhaps something else. Elise. She was stirring the pot without ever appearing on the surface. Donovan couldn't prove it, but he felt her hand in every movement, every shift in public sentiment, every smirk from a competitor who once feared him. One evening, during a conference call with European partners, he noticed his own voice trembling slightly. It was subtle, maybe imperceptible to others, but not to him. He was slipping. For the first time in his career, Donovan Blake felt unsure, cornered, reactive. He canceled his appearance at an upcoming tech summit. He claimed scheduling conflicts, but the truth was he couldn't bear the thought of standing on a stage while the whispers grew louder. Victoria confronted him the following morning. "You're not yourself," she said, leaning against the doorframe of his study. Her tone was soft, but her eyes were sharp. "You're restless. You're distracted. What's going on?" Donovan looked at her, eyes tired, jaw clenched. "Business pressure. That's not it," she replied without hesitation. This started after the gala. After she showed up. He didn't respond. "She's got you scared, doesn't she?" He looked away, the silence confirming everything. Victoria stepped closer. "What is she doing, Donovan?" "I don't know," he muttered, barely audible. "I don't know what she's planning." Victoria studied him for a moment longer. Maybe that's what makes it worse. And it did. It was the not knowing that gnawed at him more than anything else. If Elise had threatened him outright, he could prepare. If she had gone to the media herself, he could spin it. But she hadn't. She was dismantling him from the shadows, and the silence between her moves only amplified the terror of what would come next. Another week passed. Another leak hit the press. This time, it involved internal emails, ones that revealed the deliberate collapse of a competitor through fabricated compliance failures. The fallout was immediate. The SEC launched a preliminary inquiry. One board member resigned publicly. Donovan was summoned to an emergency shareholder meeting. The room was filled with people he once controlled, now watching him with doubt. He gave another speech. He blamed hackers. He promised transparency. But as he spoke, he noticed the way some of them avoided eye contact, the way others whispered among themselves. He was no longer the man at the center. He was a liability. Back at the penthouse, he received another flash drive. This time, it wasn't business files. It was a video, grainy, dated, from a hidden camera in one of his old properties. It showed a meeting between Donovan and a city official, discussing permits, under-the-table favors, and untraceable payments. Donovan watched it in silence, his jaw clenched, stomach turning. He remembered that day. He had thought the conversation was private, unrecorded. He had been wrong. The accompanying note was just one sentence. "Still think you're untouchable?" He poured himself another drink. His hands shook. Elise wasn't just pulling strings. She was unraveling his entire foundation, one thread at a time. He called his lawyer, instructed him to start preparing contingency plans, asset protection strategies, offshore options, exit routes. But he knew deep down, it was too late for protection. This wasn't about money anymore. This was personal. It was intimate. It was surgical. Donovan began waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, plagued by dreams where he stood alone in the ruins of a glass tower while faceless crowds whispered his name in shame. He started losing weight. His temper grew short. He snapped at staff, barked at Marla for forgetting appointments she hadn't actually missed. The fear of collapse had begun to change him from within, and Elise knew it. She wasn't trying to destroy his empire in one grand blow. That would have been too easy. She was dismantling it slowly, deliberately, methodically, like peeling away the walls of a fortress until the king inside realized there was nothing left to defend. And somewhere, in another quiet cafe, Elise crossed off another item on her list. The morning sunlight spilled across Donovan Blake's penthouse like it always did, but to him, it felt harsh now, unforgiving. The shadows it cast on the floor seemed longer than usual, more ominous. He stood barefoot near the window, coffee growing cold in his hand, eyes scanning the horizon as if the skyline could offer answers. But there were no answers there. Only the sinking realization that the empire he had spent his life building was being pulled apart, and the hands unraveling it belonged to the woman he had so easily discarded. It was no longer just a matter of bad press or isolated leaks. Now, there were patterns forming. Whispers that began in boardrooms were now echoing through investor reports. Anonymous sources had morphed into internal whistleblowers. Regulators had gone from curious to concerned. Every move he made was met with resistance. Every decision questioned. Every press release dissected for inconsistencies. Something was wrong in every department. Projects that had once moved seamlessly now hit inexplicable delays. Permits revoked. Contracts terminated. Stakeholders walking away without explanation. Donovan could no longer deny it. This wasn't coincidence. It was sabotage. Strategic, quiet, and expertly timed. And he had no idea where the next blow would come from. He called an emergency meeting with his executive team, demanding updates. They came with charts and spreadsheets, desperate to explain the recent downturns, each one blaming external factors, market shifts, unpredictable forces. But Donovan knew better. He could feel the invisible hand pressing against everything he touched. When the meeting ended, he remained in his chair, alone, long after the room had emptied, staring at the wall where the company's quarterly growth graph used to hang. He had ordered it taken down last week, unable to bear its steady decline. His phone buzzed. A message from Victoria. Dinner tonight. He ignored it. Victoria had become a distraction he could no longer afford. She'd grown irritated with his mood swings, his distant glances, his sleepless nights. She didn't understand the gravity of what was happening, and he couldn't risk her becoming a liability. He'd stopped bringing her to events. She was no longer part of the carefully crafted image. Donovan had learned long ago that when things start to crumble, you shed weight. And right now, everything that wasn't essential was weight. He needed control back. He needed information. That night, he made a call to an old contact, a private investigator who specialized in digital intelligence. He offered a generous sum in exchange for one thing: find out who Elise had been meeting since her return. He didn't want speculation. He wanted names, dates, locations. He needed leverage, something he could use to shift the balance back in his favor. But he underestimated her again. The investigator called back 2 days later. "She's clean," he said, voice low and uncertain. "No meetings. No digital trail. No credit card activity. She's like smoke, untouchable." Donovan clenched his jaw. Nobody is untouchable. But deep down, a sliver of doubt crept in. Maybe she had help. Maybe someone on the inside was feeding her information. He began scrutinizing his own staff more closely, replacing assistants, installing surveillance, micromanaging projects he used to delegate. His paranoia grew. Every knock on his door made him tense. Every email felt like a threat. Then, the final blow came from someone he hadn't suspected: Marla. She had been his assistant for years, loyal, efficient, discreet. He trusted her more than anyone. But one afternoon, while reviewing internal communications, he stumbled upon a message she had sent from her personal email. It was vague, just a string of phrases referencing file transfers and timing, but the recipient's email address was familiar. Elise's alias. Donovan felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He didn't confront Marla. He simply terminated her the next day, quietly, without explanation. But the damage was done. Elise had been inside all along. The realization haunted him. His empire wasn't just under attack. It had been infiltrated. And the worst part? Elise wasn't trying to destroy him all at once. She was bleeding him slowly, making him feel each cut, each loss. Like death by 1,000 paper cuts. He couldn't defend against an enemy who didn't fight in the open. He couldn't counter an attack when the attacker refused to play by his rules. It was infuriating, humiliating. He was a man used to taking power, not begging to keep it. And Elise? She was nowhere. No interviews. No social media. No press conferences. Just that one haunting appearance at the gala. And since then, only silence. The kind of silence that screamed. He started losing sleep entirely. He'd lie in bed for hours, mind spinning, chest tight, pulse erratic. He began talking to himself, rehearsing conversations that would never happen, apologies he would never give, threats he couldn't deliver. Sometimes he thought he saw her in the shadows, her silhouette in reflections, her voice in passing murmurs. It wasn't madness. It was guilt, or fear, or both. Then, late one night, there was a knock at his door. Not the penthouse entrance. The private side door, one only Elise had ever used. His breath hitched. He stood still for a moment, heart pounding, unsure whether to answer. But curiosity won. He opened the door and found a package. A simple, brown box. No note. No markings. He brought it inside, placed it on the marble countertop, stared at it for minutes before lifting the lid. Inside was a framed photo. Not of Elise. Not of him. It was a photograph of a small group of people, former employees of one of the companies he had ruthlessly acquired and shut down years ago. Smiling. Happy. Whole. Taped to the back was a newspaper clipping from a few months after the acquisition. A story about mass layoffs, foreclosures, the suicide of a former manager. Donovan dropped the frame. It shattered on the floor, glass splintering across the tiles. And again, that same message, scrawled in familiar handwriting. This is not about revenge. It's about memory. He sank into a chair, face buried in his hands. Elise wasn't just targeting him. She was making him remember. Every name, every face, every consequence he had brushed aside in pursuit of power. She was forcing him to feel it. Not publicly, not for show, but privately. In his home, in his silence, in his isolation. And that, perhaps, was the worst punishment of all. The conference room was packed, but the atmosphere was brittle, fragile like the edge of a blade. Donovan Blake sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by a dozen of his top executives, yet never had he felt more isolated. The once unwavering loyalty etched on their faces had slowly transformed into a mixture of skepticism, caution, and carefully masked fear. He could see it in the way they glanced sideways at one another before responding to his questions, in how their voices now carried undertones of doubt. They no longer saw him as invincible. They saw him as a man under siege. Another scandal had erupted that morning. This time, it wasn't anonymous. A former employee had come forward on national television with documents, emails, and a detailed timeline of how Donovan had orchestrated layoffs to manipulate stock value right before a merger. The broadcast had spread like wildfire. News anchors dissected the timeline in real time. Headlines screamed betrayal, and social media erupted in condemnation. It wasn't just a dent in his reputation, it was an explosion. And still, Elise remained absent from the public eye. No interviews, no statements, no appearances. But Donovan felt her fingerprints all over this. He could almost hear her voice beneath the headlines, whispering through every sentence spoken by those now emboldened to expose him. She was orchestrating this with unnerving elegance, crafting a symphony of reckoning while never touching a single note herself. After the meeting, Donovan retreated to his private office, locking the door behind him. He loosened his tie, rubbed his temples, and stared at his own reflection in the glass wall. He barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes were sunken, skin pallid, jaw tight with strain. The weight of the collapsing empire pressed down on his shoulders like a storm cloud. He couldn't deny it anymore. He was losing. He spent the afternoon trying to strategize a counterattack, but nothing stuck. Every move he made now seemed reactive, desperate. The media no longer trusted his statements. His investors questioned his leadership. Even his competitors, once afraid to challenge him, had begun circling like vultures. Elise hadn't just dismantled his defenses, she had turned him into prey. That evening, he received another package. This one was different, not from Elise, not marked by her now familiar handwriting. The return address was from a small town he barely remembered, one of the many places he had passed through during his aggressive acquisition phase. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from a man named Peter Harlow, a former business owner whose company had been consumed and liquidated by Blake Industries 5 years earlier. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was honest. Peter wrote of how his business had taken decades to build, how it had employed dozens of families in his town, how it had once been the beating heart of the community, and how, in a matter of months, Donovan's deal had erased all of it. Not with malice, but with indifference. Peter described the days after the sale, how his employees struggled to find work, how the town's economy collapsed, how he eventually lost his home. He ended the letter with a single sentence. "I'm not asking for an apology. I just want you to know that we existed." Donovan read the letter twice, then a third time. He sat silently for a long while, staring at the paper in his hands. The words carved deep into him, not because of their sentiment, but because of their truth. Elise wasn't just forcing him to face consequences. She was holding up a mirror. She was making him see every forgotten face, every casualty, every life that had been a footnote in his success story. And for the first time in years, he truly saw them. The next morning, Donovan did something unusual. He left the city. No staff, no bodyguards, no press. Just him, alone behind the wheel of a black sedan, driving toward the address from Peter's letter. The town was smaller than he remembered, quieter. The main street was lined with closed shops, faded paint, and empty storefronts. He parked near what used to be the manufacturing plant, now a fenced-off lot with overgrown weeds and rusted gates. The ghost of his ambition stood before him, lifeless. He found Peter in a modest house a few blocks away, sitting on a porch with a coffee mug in hand. The older man stared at him as he approached, unsurprised. "I didn't expect a response," Peter said, rising slowly to his feet. "I didn't come to respond," Donovan replied, voice hoarse. "I came to understand." Peter nodded once, then gestured toward a seat beside him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun inch across the sky. Eventually, Peter began talking, not just about his business, but about his town, his people, his life before Donovan had changed everything. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply told stories. And for hours, Donovan listened. When he left that town, something in him had shifted. The arrogance wasn't gone, but it was cracked. The guilt wasn't yet healing, but it was acknowledged. He returned to the city carrying the weight of more than just his failures. He carried faces, names, memories. And as he stood again in his penthouse, the skyline no longer looked victorious. It looked distant, cold, foreign. That night, Elise called. Not a letter, not a package, a voice. "Did you go see them?" she asked. Her tone was neutral, not triumphant. "I did," Donovan answered. There was a long pause. "You're beginning to see it," she said quietly. "I'm beginning to feel it," he admitted. "Good," she replied. "Because this was never about destroying you. It was about showing you what you've been blind to all along." Donovan didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just listened, for once. And when the call ended, he realized something chilling. Elise wasn't done. Not yet. She had changed the way the world saw him. Now, she was changing the way he saw himself. The headlines hit like thunderclaps. Bold, brutal, relentless. Blake Industries under federal investigation. Whistleblower exposes decades of corruption. The fall of Donovan Blake, an empire built on sand. Each article cut deeper than the last, not only because of what they said, but because of the names attached to them. Reputable journalists, former allies, once loyal partners now distancing themselves, publicly condemning the very man they once praised. Donovan's empire was no longer cracking. It was collapsing, and he stood in the center of it, unable to stop the walls from closing in. The SEC had officially launched an inquiry. A subpoena followed. His legal team scrambled, issuing press statements, denying allegations, threatening lawsuits, but none of it mattered. The damage had already been done. Investors pulled out in waves. Stock prices plunged. Partnerships were dissolved overnight. And for the first time since he had clawed his way into the world of power and privilege, Donovan found himself on the defensive, not just in the press, but in every corridor of influence he had once ruled. His office became a fortress, sealed off by layers of legal advisors, PR managers, and internal investigators. The tension was suffocating. Every meeting felt like a funeral procession. Every email was a potential landmine. The sound of a phone ringing sent jolts through his spine. His once flawless reputation now carried a stench he couldn't wash off, no matter how many polished statements his publicist crafted. But perhaps what struck him hardest was the silence that echoed around him. Those who used to cling to his every word now avoided eye contact. Colleagues he'd mentored now ignored his calls. The loyalty he had once purchased with bonuses and benefits evaporated the moment his power began to wane. He wasn't just falling from grace. He was being erased from the very circles he had helped shape. And Elise still hadn't uttered a word in public. She didn't need to. Her silence had become the sharpest weapon in her arsenal. While Donovan tried to plug leaks and manage the fallout, Elise pulled strings behind curtains, unseen but always present. A former executive she once befriended had gone on record anonymously, providing documents. A long-retired auditor had resurfaced, presenting irregularities from acquisitions Donovan had forgotten. Even an old intern, fired years ago without cause, had suddenly gone viral with a thread detailing her mistreatment under his leadership. One by one, the dominoes fell, each one echoing with Elise's fingerprints, even though her name remained unspoken. Donovan tried to retaliate. He instructed his legal team to file counterclaims, to threaten litigation against whistleblowers, to dig into the lives of those now speaking out. But each attempt backfired. The media framed it as intimidation tactics. The public, once indifferent, now rallied behind those who spoke against him. The narrative had shifted permanently. He was no longer a self-made visionary. He was a predator in a tailored suit. His home became a prison. Victoria had long since vanished from the picture, her absence so complete it was as if she'd never existed. The penthouse, once a symbol of dominance, now felt hollow. The echo of his own footsteps haunted the halls. The city skyline mocked him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd stand there at night, glass in hand, staring into the dark, wondering when exactly the shift began. Was it when Elise vanished? Or had it started long before that? When he stopped seeing people as human beings and began treating them as tools, stepping stones, obstacles? And then came the final leak. A full dossier, anonymous, but unmistakably curated by someone with intimate knowledge, was published in an exclusive exposé. It contained a detailed timeline of Donovan's most unethical business dealings, confidential memos, internal correspondence, even surveillance footage from meetings thought to be private. The article was damning, not because of its content. Donovan had seen worse behind closed doors, but because of its precision. There was no guesswork, no speculation. Everything was documented, traced, confirmed. Elise had turned every piece of information he'd discarded, every careless word, every reckless decision, into a weapon. The dossier ended with a chilling sentence. Power is not immunity, and silence is not forgetfulness. Donovan felt something inside him fracture. He didn't move for hours that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor while the city carried on without him. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He barely breathed. His phone buzzed constantly, attorneys, advisors, journalists, but he ignored them all. He had nothing left to say. His mother called the next morning, voice trembling. "Donovan, what's happening? They're saying such awful things. Is any of it true?" He didn't respond. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because for the first time, he didn't have the strength to lie. The following week, a court date was set. A congressional hearing was scheduled. News outlets speculated whether criminal charges would follow. Protesters began gathering outside his office building, waving signs that read justice, accountability, and you're not above the law. Photos of Elise, still from years ago, began circulating online again, this time not as the missing wife of a millionaire, but as a symbol of resistance. Her face, once a silent accessory to his success, had become a quiet revolution. Donovan couldn't escape her anymore. She was in every headline, every conversation, every crack in the empire she helped expose. He saw her in dreams, sometimes angry, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes distant. He'd wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, only to find the room empty and silent. He wanted to hate her, to curse her name, to scream into the void about betrayal and vengeance. But somewhere, buried beneath his rage and ruin, he knew this wasn't vengeance. It was consequence, and it was only just beginning. It began on a Tuesday morning, as most unremarkable days do. The air was still, the city moved with its usual rhythm, and Donovan Blake sat alone in the vast emptiness of his once grand office, staring blankly at the flickering screen of his muted television. The news anchor's voice, though silent, repeated the same devastating headline in the ticker below. Blake Industries CEO faces indictment amid corruption scandal. The letters scrolled relentlessly, each one another nail hammered into the coffin of his legacy. Outside, reporters swarmed the entrance of the building he had once ruled like a king. Inside, it was eerily quiet. Most of his senior staff had resigned or taken extended leave. Only a skeleton crew remained, and even they moved through the halls like ghosts, heads down, eyes avoiding his. He hadn't spoken a word in hours. The phone on his desk had rung itself hoarse, flashing urgent messages from lawyers, crisis managers, and what remained of his board. He ignored them all. There was nothing left to say. The empire was no longer just falling. It was in free fall, and he was the only one left watching the wreckage in real time. The halls that once echoed with meetings, strategic talks, and celebratory toasts now rang with a silence more deafening than any confrontation. His footsteps sounded hollow when he walked. His own reflection in the polished elevator mirrored a man he no longer recognized, disheveled, thinner, grayer. The suit he wore didn't fit the way it used to, as if his body had finally begun reflecting the decay of his soul. The financial blow had been severe, but it wasn't the part that hurt most. Money could be recovered, fortunes rebuilt. What shattered him was the irreversible collapse of identity. Donovan had never separated himself from his empire. It wasn't just a business. It was his ego, his power, his worth. Without it, he didn't know who he was. The fear that haunted him now wasn't losing assets or property. It was the terrifying possibility that there was nothing underneath the layers of success he had spent his life constructing. The day the indictment was made public, he found himself standing in the same boardroom where, just months ago, he had mocked a junior executive for wearing an off-brand tie. Now, that same executive's seat sat vacant, the irony heavy and unforgiving. Donovan walked slowly around the long table, fingertips brushing the surface, recalling the deals, the arguments, the victories that had once made this room feel like the throne of a kingdom. Now, it was just a relic of a dynasty turned to dust. He had expected Elise to gloat by now, to surface and claim her victory with the theatrical flair he'd always associated with revenge. But she remained silent, and somehow, that silence hurt more than if she had stood before him with scathing words. Because it meant she didn't need to watch him fall. She had already seen it coming. She didn't crave spectacle. She had always wanted consequence. And she got it, without ever needing to raise her voice. Later that week, the first court hearing was scheduled. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, capturing every inch of his descent. He walked through them in silence, flanked by lawyers, wearing sunglasses not to shield himself from the sun, but from the weight of 1,000 eyes now filled with judgment. Inside, the proceedings began with formality, but Donovan barely heard the words. His mind wandered, his thoughts scattered. He wasn't thinking about his defense strategy or his plea. He was thinking about Elise, about how she had vanished without a trace, only to return like a phantom that could not be touched, only felt. About the photo of the child on the beach. He still didn't know who that child was, or if it had any connection to her or him, but it haunted him nonetheless. Was it meant to confuse him? Was it symbolic? Or had she truly carried something deeper, a secret he hadn't yet grasped? That lingering question gnawed at him day and night, as if Elise had left one final thread untied, an invisible string keeping him tangled in guilt and doubt. He tried once more to track her down, hired another private investigator, doubled the retainer, offered bonuses for every lead. But every trail went cold. Elise didn't want to be found. She wanted him to remain chasing a shadow, trapped in the labyrinth of his own conscience. And in that endless maze, he began to see himself clearly for the first time. One night, after another long day of meetings with attorneys and asset managers, Donovan sat alone in his penthouse. The air was thick with the scent of old liquor and stale silence. He poured himself a drink, but this time, not out of habit or taste. He poured it to watch the amber liquid swirl, to feel the weight of the glass in his hand. Simple sensations that once brought comfort, now hollow rituals. He stood near the window, watching the city that had once felt like his playground now stretch before him like a stranger. The skyline was unchanged, but it didn't belong to him anymore. His phone buzzed again, another message from his lawyer. Need to finalize your asset disclosure by morning. Prosecutor is pushing hard. He didn't reply. Instead, he walked into the room Elise used to call hers. He hadn't stepped foot in it since her disappearance. He expected dust and cobwebs, but the staff had kept it tidy, preserved like a memory he'd tried to erase. He stood in the doorway for a long time, afraid to enter. When he finally did, he walked slowly, fingers grazing the furniture she once loved. The bookshelf still held a few of her old titles. A scarf hung behind the door. A faint trace of her perfume still clung to the air, and it hit him with an ache he hadn't expected. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and for the first time in years, he wept, not out of fear, not out of rage, but out of a grief he didn't know he carried. Grief for the woman he had never truly known, for the life he had buried under layers of ambition and greed, for the empire he had built not with vision, but with conquest. When he finally stopped crying, the room felt different. Still, but not empty. Broken, but not dead. And that was when he saw it. A note tucked beneath a book on the nightstand. Not new. Old, yellowing at the corners. He opened it slowly, recognizing Elise's handwriting instantly. Not everything broken must be destroyed. But sometimes, it must be left behind. There was no signature. No explanation. Just one final whisper from the past. Donovan sat there for hours, holding that note, letting it sink into his bones. The empire was gone. The power was gone. But something else remained. Something he couldn't name yet. Something painful and unfinished. And he knew, somehow, the real reckoning was still to come. The courthouse smelled like old wood, ink, and tension. Donovan Blake stood just behind the polished mahogany doors, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes shining, his posture a final attempt at dignity. But beneath the surface, nothing remained of the man he once was. He had walked into courtrooms before, often to seal deals, deliver testimonies that solidified his empire, but never like this. Never as the accused. Never as a man whose name had become synonymous not with brilliance, but with betrayal. Outside, cameras snapped with mechanical precision, capturing every flicker of his expression. Inside, the murmur of anticipation among reporters and spectators rose and fell like a tide. The hearing was procedural, the charges formalized, the room sterile and efficient. But what made Donovan's hands tremble slightly wasn't the judge's voice or the prosecutor's summary of allegations. It was the eyes watching him. The people in the gallery weren't just journalists and legal observers. Some of them were familiar. Some of them were former employees, former partners, people he had once spoken over, dismissed, exploited. He recognized a few faces from articles and protest footage, and he knew others only by the way their expressions flickered when his name was spoken. There was no rage in their eyes now, only a quiet satisfaction, a collective reckoning as they watched the man who had once towered over them reduced to a defendant in a suit that now felt like a costume. His lawyer spoke on his behalf, but the words felt distant, hollow. Pleas of not guilty, arguments about due process, the typical language of damage control. Donovan sat quietly, nodding when prompted, playing the role he had to play. But inside, something had shifted. There was no adrenaline, no righteous anger, no fire left to fan. Only fatigue. Only the hollow echo of his own undoing. When the hearing ended, he was escorted out through the side entrance. There were no cheers, no jeers, only silence and the flash of cameras. The noise had faded not because people didn't care, but because his story had already been written. Now, they were only waiting for the final chapter. Back at his penthouse, Donovan found it harder to breathe. The rooms felt smaller, the walls closer. The same expansive windows that once gave him a sense of power now made him feel exposed, like the city outside was watching him, waiting for him to crumble completely. He hadn't seen anyone in days, not Victoria, not colleagues, not even his lawyers in person. Everything was digital now. Transactions, discussions, obligations, cold, pixelated exchanges without warmth or comfort. He ate meals alone, if he ate at all. He wandered rooms with no purpose, checked emails he no longer needed to answer, and stared at screens without absorbing their content. And then came the letter. Not a message from his attorneys or a media inquiry, but a handwritten envelope, plain, unmarked, left at his doorstep like a ghost from the past. He didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Elise. His fingers hesitated as he slid it open, heart pounding not with fear, but with something stranger, longing, perhaps. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No accusations, no threats, just an address and a time. No explanation, no instructions, just that. He almost didn't go. He told himself it was foolish, that it could be a trap, a trick, a cruel twist of her design. But a part of him, buried beneath layers of denial and defeat, still needed to understand. Still needed closure. Still needed her, if not to forgive him, then at least to help him face what remained of himself. He arrived at the location just before dusk. It was a modest property on the outskirts of the city, nothing like the luxurious spaces he was used to. A narrow path led to a small garden, wild and overgrown but beautiful in its own quiet way. The house was simple, white-painted wood, weathered by time, with ivy climbing its sides. He stood at the gate for a long time before pushing it open. Elise was already there, standing near a bench beneath a tree, her posture calm, her hands gently folded in front of her. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a soft gray dress that moved slightly with the breeze. She didn't smile when she saw him, but she didn't look away either. Donovan approached slowly, unsure of what to say. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't tense. It was heavy, filled with things too deep for words. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, breaking the stillness. "You knew I would," he replied. She nodded. "Not because of obligation, because of need." He lowered his gaze. "I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore." Elise gestured for him to sit. They sat together on the bench, the world quiet around them except for the rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence was not the kind that demanded to be filled. It was the kind that allowed things to surface slowly. "I wanted you to see this place," Elise said eventually, her voice steady. "It belonged to someone I met while I was away. A woman who lost everything when one of your acquisitions forced her into bankruptcy. She rebuilt her life here, quietly, with dignity." Donovan didn't respond. "She's not here anymore," Elise continued. "She passed last year, but she left this place to me, told me to use it to help others find their footing again." Donovan looked at the house, then at Elise. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because before you can rebuild anything, you have to sit in the ashes of what you've destroyed. Not just business, not just wealth, but people, lives." He swallowed hard. "And after that, then you decide if there's anything left worth salvaging." She reached into her bag and handed him a small box. Inside was the same photograph he had seen months ago, the one from the beach. But this time, there was a second photo beneath it. A closer image of the child. A little boy, eyes that mirrored Donovan's, unmistakably. He stared at the photo, breath caught, the world tilting beneath him. "He's yours," Elise said gently. "Born after I left. I didn't plan to keep it from you forever, but I needed you to face yourself first." Donovan blinked, eyes burning, throat tightening. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He simply held the photo in his shaking hands, the weight of truth pressing down on him like never before. "You can be part of his life," Elise continued, "but not as the man you were. Only as the man you're willing to become." And with those words, the final piece of his downfall became clear. Not humiliation, not public disgrace, not financial ruin. The real punishment was realizing what he had lost, what he had nearly never known, and what he might still be able to reclaim, if he could rise from the ashes of who he used to be. The sound of the courthouse door slamming shut behind Donovan Blake reverberated in his mind long after he left the building. He moved through the parking lot in a haze, barely noticing the flashes of cameras, the murmurs from reporters, the disapproving glares from strangers. His feet moved on instinct, but his mind was elsewhere, still sitting on that weathered bench in front of the little house Elise had shown him, still staring at the photograph of the boy with his eyes. His son, a truth that hit harder than any indictment ever could. He had spent his life chasing power, wealth, control, and in doing so, he had unknowingly abandoned the one thing he never knew he needed, the fragile, irreplaceable chance to be a father. And that truth tore through him with a sharpness that made every scandal, every lawsuit, every headline feel insignificant by comparison. 4 days after that meeting, Donovan stayed home, rarely leaving his penthouse, speaking to no one except his attorneys and financial advisors. The walls felt even colder now, every corner echoing with memories he had long suppressed. The opulence that once made him feel invincible now felt suffocating. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, designer furniture, all remnants of a man who had built his world on surfaces, never substance. He wandered through rooms that once hosted lavish parties, now reduced to empty chambers of regret. His son, the words repeated in his head constantly, like a chant, a prayer, a curse. He imagined what the boy looked like now, how tall he might be, how he laughed, whether he asked about his father. He wondered what Elise told him, if anything. He thought about the milestones he had missed, the first words, first steps, the birthdays uncelebrated it. And for the first time, he felt something deeper than guilt. He felt shame. Not for what he had lost, but for the man he had been. A man who would have never appreciated fatherhood even if it had been offered to him then. A man who would have seen his own child as a complication, an inconvenience, a liability in his empire's blueprint. That was the man Elise had walked away from. That was the man she refused to let anywhere near their child until he was no longer a threat to the boy's peace. He didn't fight her decision. He didn't call, didn't demand custody or visitation. He didn't even ask for another meeting. He knew this wasn't about rights or legal claims. It was about trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild with signatures. It rebuilds with action, with humility, with time. So Donovan did what no one expected him to do. He stepped back. He began liquidating his assets, not just to prepare for mounting legal costs, but because he no longer wanted to own the things that had cost him everything. He sold his penthouse and moved into a modest apartment in a quieter part of the city. His luxury cars were auctioned off. His collection of rare watches, art, and vintage wines was dismantled piece by piece. Not because he needed to financially. He still had enough resources to live comfortably, but because he needed to shed the weight of the man he used to be. He needed to begin again, not as a millionaire trying to rebrand, but as a man trying to atone. And yet, the world didn't stop watching him. Every move he made was scrutinized. Media outlets speculated endlessly. Was this a PR strategy? A performance? A calculated play to earn public sympathy? But those closest to the story began to see something different. He no longer appeared on red carpets, no longer gave interviews. He declined invitations to galas and refused offers for exclusive tell-all documentaries. He simply vanished from the public scene, retreating into obscurity without a speech or a farewell. For a man who had once craved the spotlight, it was the loudest silence of all. He began volunteering at small organizations. At first, no one recognized him. And when someone eventually did, he didn't deny who he was. He acknowledged his past without excuses, offered help quietly, and kept his head down. He didn't speak of redemption. He didn't try to reframe his narrative. He simply showed up, day after day, hands dirty with real work, not contracts. Eyes focused on tasks, not headlines. And slowly, he changed. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but incrementally. Internally, weeks turned into months. His court cases dragged on, but he no longer flinched at every update. He accepted the consequences of his actions with the quiet endurance of a man who had already faced a greater sentence, the loss of himself, of his identity, of the chance to be present in his own child's life. The legal punishments were just the shadows of a storm he'd already weathered in his soul. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Elise. He opened it slowly, heart thudding. "I see what you're doing," the note read. "I don't know if it's change or guilt, but I see it. I'm watching. Not for me, for him." That was all. No invitation. No forgiveness. but also no condemnation. It was more than he expected, and far more than he deserved. He placed the letter on his desk, beside the photograph of the boy. A new photo, this time sent by Elise. The child was older now, laughing, eyes bright. He looked happy, whole, unbothered by the shadows of a man he'd never met. Donovan stared at it for a long time, then turned to the window. The city skyline looked different from this angle, not towering, but distant, not something to conquer, but something to coexist with. He had lost everything he thought mattered, but in losing it, he had found something far more painful and more honest. The price of betrayal was not the collapse of an empire. It was living long enough to understand exactly what you destroyed and still choosing to face it every day, even when no one is watching. Especially then. The apartment was quiet that morning, not with the oppressive stillness of grief or shame, but the kind of peaceful silence that came after a long, exhausting storm. Light poured gently through the small window near the kitchen, illuminating the faded hardwood floors and casting soft shadows on the walls. Donovan Blake stood barefoot near the counter, stirring his coffee slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. There was no rush anymore. No conference call to join, no press release to approve, no executive meeting to dominate. The ticking of the old wall clock now felt more significant than the sharp clicks of corporate strategy slides. The rhythm of his days had shifted. It was no longer dictated by ambition, but by intention. He looked around the modest space he now called home. It was not extravagant by any measure, just a two-bedroom apartment in an old building nestled between a bookstore and a bakery. The furniture was simple, worn but comfortable, each piece chosen not for aesthetics, but for practicality. The walls held no awards, no magazine covers, no memorabilia of a past life. The only decoration was a small photo frame on the shelf beside the window, a picture of a boy, standing in a park, mid-laugh, arms wide open as if embracing the world. Donovan often found himself staring at that photo for minutes at a time, memorizing the contours of the child's face, the innocence in his expression, the joy untouched by legacy or scandal. He hadn't seen him in person yet. Elise had made it clear. This path would be slow, earned, not inherited. And Donovan understood that. He didn't push, didn't plead. He knew that trust, once lost, demanded quiet persistence, not grand gestures. So he waited, not passively, but with purpose. He showed up every week at the foundation Elise now directed, a small nonprofit organization built to support families affected by corporate malpractice. Families like those Donovan's empire had once crushed without a second thought. He worked in the background, sorting donations, repairing shelves, coordinating deliveries. No one there called him sir. No one asked for favors. Most didn't even know who he really was, and he didn't offer it. He had learned to listen more than speak. He had learned to carry boxes instead of dictating orders. And in that humility, he had discovered something strange, peace. A peace that wasn't built on power, but on presence. There was dignity in small things. In a conversation with a struggling father trying to rebuild his life. In helping a mother fill out forms for housing assistance. In fixing a broken faucet in the foundation's office kitchen. These things were not headlines. They were not leverage. But they were real. And real, Donovan had come to understand, was something he had rarely been. One afternoon, after a long shift organizing a community pantry, he stepped outside to catch his breath. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft hues of dusk. He leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve, when he heard a voice behind him. "You missed a spot," Elise said. He turned slowly, startled, and there she was, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes watching him with a mix of curiosity and quiet approval. "I did," he asked, glancing down at his shirt. She smirked. "The corner shelves. You stacked the cans backward." He laughed gently. "I guess I'm still learning." "You are," she said. "But you're trying." There was a pause between them, a soft lull in the moment. She stepped closer, her gaze lingering on his face. He looked different now. Older, of course, but more than that. Softer, less guarded. He didn't carry himself like a man looking to control the world anymore. He looked like someone learning how to belong in it again. "I saw the letter you sent," she said, referring to the note he had mailed a week earlier. It hadn't been elaborate, just a few sentences. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read. "But I'm grateful you gave me the chance to become someone worth forgiving." I meant it, he said quietly now. I know, she replied. They walked together through the alley behind the building, neither speaking for a while. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was warm, companionable. When they reached the end of the path, Elise stopped and looked at him. He's curious about you, she said. His heart jumped. I've told him little things, she continued. That you like strong coffee, that you once tripped over your own feet trying to impress someone at a college debate, that you have a terrible singing voice. He chuckled, eyes glistening. All true. He doesn't know your past, she said. Not the headlines. Not the empire. He just knows there's a man trying to be better. And for now, that's enough. Donovan didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his hands trembling slightly. You'll meet him soon, Elise said softly, placing a hand gently on his arm. But when you do, don't try to be perfect. Just be present. He nodded. The tears came then, silent and unforced, not from grief or guilt this time, but from something deeper. Hope. Fragile, tender, unfamiliar, but real. And in that moment, something inside him shifted again. A quiet release. A slow breath. A step forward. Weeks passed, and the world slowly forgot about Donovan Blake. The headlines moved on. The lawsuits faded into paperwork, the scandal into history. But in a small corner of the city, in a community center filled with shelves of food and laughter, a different story was being written. One without press coverage or glossy photographs. One of redemption, of quiet effort, of trying every single day to be a man worthy of the second chance life had handed him. And one bright afternoon, in a park not far from that center, a boy ran across a patch of grass and stopped a few feet away from a man sitting on a bench. Are you the guy who sings badly? He asked, eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Donovan blinked, then smiled, heart full. Yeah, he said. That's me. The boy laughed and sat beside him. And just like that, a new beginning quietly began.